everyone, and welcome on behalf of the National Conservation Training Center. My name is Jim Siegel. I'm the Ecology Curriculum Manager at NCTC, and I have just a few pre-webinar details to run through before we get started. Next slide, please. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services programs, the Forest Ecology Working Group, Science Applications and Migratory Bird Programs, and NCTC, the National Conservation Training Center, are joining the USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, NIACS, in sponsoring this webinar series. If you are interested in more information about the Forest Ecology Working Group, please contact Jeff Horan, and his email is indicated there. And if you're having some problems with registration or other technical issues, you can contact me, Jim Siegel. And I'm also the one that will help you get CEU credits either through the Wildlife Society or the Society of American Foresters. And if you're interested in SAF credits, please contact me and I'll give you some more information about it. Next slide, please. First, a little disclaimer. This product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright and may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. Next slide, please. This webinar is being recorded live. And if you need to ask questions, you're going to have to use the chat function. Next slide, please. The chat function can be located down at the middle left. You can see there under chat, and you can type your questions in there, and please send that question to everyone, and everyone will be able to see the questions, and we will be answering them live during the webinar. Next slide, please.
Oh, I think that one's for me, Jim. Thank you. So hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Horan with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Forest Ecology Working Group, and I'm one of the creators and moderators for this webinar series. So I really want to welcome you to this kickoff of our 13-part webinar series, which is called Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife. And I also want to thank the many folks that stuck with us through our last 12-part Forest for the Birds webinar series that we just wrapped up last month. But this 12-part series tells a story about climate change and its impacts on forest ecosystems and forest-dependent wildlife species. We're going to examine forest ecosystems. We're going to examine their composition and structure under a changing climate and the influence on wildlife populations and also on carbon dynamics. We will also share tools and management approaches to help facilitate forest and wildlife climate adaptation at both landscape and stand scales. And so today's presentation of our Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife series is going to be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Climate Change Action Program and Nature-Based Solutions for Forest Adaptation. We're going to have Kurt Johnson and Sara Ward, both from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, speaking today. Next slide, please, Amanda. And so now for introductions for both Sara and Kurt. So Sara Ward is an ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in our Raleigh field office. She went to the Duke School of Environment, where she got her master's in environmental toxicology and chemistry, and she has her BA from the St. Mary's College of Maryland in biology. Sara's work has focused on offsetting carbon pollution impacts and leveraging resources and emerging climate tools to expand the service's delivery of priority conservation and restoration to address climate change, mitigation, and adaptation for climate vulnerable trust resources, including national wildlife refuges and aquatic listed species. Highlights include quantifying the benefits of a 40,000 acre peatland restoration project at Pocosin Lakes, and you guys are going to hear about that a little bit today, and co-authoring Pocosin strategies for the North Carolina Natural and Working Lands Action Plan, and coordinating the Fish and Wildlife Service's Nature-Based Solutions Work Group of the Climate Change Action Program, which you're also going to hear part about. And now for Kurt. I'll go ahead and introduce Kurt as well. And Kurt Johnson is a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Science Application Program and headquarters. And Kurt has a BS in wildlife ecology from Utah State University and his MS in wildlife ecology all from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his PhD is in animal ecology from Utah State University. Kurt has worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for more than 24 years. That's since 2006 as a wildlife biologist and climate adaptation specialist in the Science Applications Program. He helped develop the service's Climate Change Action Program and now helps coordinate its implementation, including work on biological carbon sequestration. And before we turn it over to Sara and Kurt, I was just going to run a commercial for our next month's webinar. And so, again, as I mentioned, this webinar does tell a story. So next month, we get into setting the stage for climate impacts. And we're fortunate to have our speaker, Dr. Jim Vose from the U.S. Forest Service and NC State, and he's going to be talking about climate change impacts on forest ecosystems with a big picture view. So with that, Sara, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for agreeing to be a presenter.
Hi, everyone. I'm trying to start my video for you. Can you see the presentation?
We can, Sara.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Sara Ward. As they mentioned, I'm an ecologist with our Raleigh field office. I'm here to talk a little bit about the Climate Change Action Program and step off into the nature-based solutions work that the service is doing. Our primary goals today are really to provide that overview of the service's Climate Change Action Program. This is something that's was released last October, and we can cover the basics of that and then discuss the service's approach to forest adaptation by utilizing nature-based solutions and specifically natural infrastructure and natural climate solutions to support our goals, and then introduce the climate adaptation for forest-dependent wildlife series that's to come. So with that, we'll jump right in. The Climate Change Action Program is really kind of an outcrop of two executive orders that were released by the Biden administration. Executive Order 14008, which was tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, and a subsequent executive order related to protecting public health and the environment and restoring science. And really that resulted in two specific plans for the department's climate action plan, and also the departmental sustainability plan. And the Fish and Wildlife Service's Climate Change Action Program is another step down plan from that, but is directly related to some of the key elements of those plans. But really it started with the foundation of our Rising to the Urgent Challenge document, which addressed some strategic planning goals for climate change from about over 10 years ago, and also the National Fish, Wildlife, Plants, and Climate Adaptation Strategy. And really the vision for the Climate Change Action Program with the service is that we will rise to the challenge of transforming landscapes and waters with skill, creativity, and innovation, and guided by science, sound science and conservation practices that all support our mission. Questioning assumptions that are based on past conditions, recognition that the past no longer informs the future, and developing new tools to address and guide our decisions, support our employees, and integrate adaptation as a guiding principle throughout the agency as we confront some new and changing future dynamics. And ultimately, we would like to be the leader in effective collaborative conservation in this rapidly changing world. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the key elements. The goal of the Climate Change Action Program is not to be a static plan, but a living framework. And there are 7 key elements to the Climate Change Action Program with teams that support the delivery of those key elements. Those key elements, I'm not going to dive deeply into the text on this slide, but certainly you'll have it to refer to at the end of this webinar series. But today we're really focusing on some of the activities of key element 1, the adaptation and resilience element, and also key element 5, climate mitigation. But these 7 elements really are explicitly to look at how we can build tools under adaptation and resilience to address on and off service land needs, including nature-based solutions, natural infrastructure, and application of the resist, accept, direct framework. The climate science element is really to essentially create a master toolkit that's going to support our staff and support the delivery of the other key elements, developing new metrics to track our progress, and developing the appropriate guidance and training to support our staff. The key element related to adaptation strategy is building on the legacy of the landscape conservation designs and applying adaptation planning for a cohesive national strategy. Also looking at watershed and regional partnership priorities and opportunities. With partnerships really wanting to look to expand our already strong partnerships with regional, tribal, First Nation, and Indigenous groups, cultivate those expanding, leveraging partnerships or impact partnerships, so to speak, so that we can be more than the sum of our parts among our different partnering groups, and really facilitating communication both internally within the agency on climate issues, but also externally as well. The climate mitigation one we'll talk a lot about today here, but really this does incorporate a lot of the natural climate solutions, which we'll be discussing here shortly, but also looking to our sustainability and renewable aspects as well, and tracking the service's carbon footprint. Under the policy key element, we're really looking at ways where our existing policies maybe don't provide enough structure and support for some of what we'd like to do on climate moving forward. So this is developing new policy as needed, but also updating existing policy to reflect our changing vision and this changing future. And then finally, capacity is really looking to the support from NCTC and others to expand capacity for implementing on the ground adaptation, resiliency, and mitigation projects, but also the educational support and staff capacity to deliver those outcomes. So the CCAP is, as I mentioned, a living whole service framework. It's cross-programmatic. It's not intended to be a program specifically, but something that is leveraged by all of the services programs. It's prioritizing strategies to maximize adaptation, resilience, and mitigation potential, really by focusing on high return investments in the right places. And we really want to also focus on optimizing and eliminating any existing barriers to deliver our climate priorities. It really is something that's building off of that strong foundation. You saw 2 documents that we already had outlined a lot of these strategies, but we want to build on that delivery experience, like things we did with Hurricane Sandy, and also the biological carbon sequestration delivery, which we'll hear some about today. And really the intent is to accelerate, scale up the on-the-ground implementation of interventions and to move the needle on climate adaptation, resiliency, and mitigation. We'd like to facilitate that cross-programmatic engagement and also cross-partnership engagement and amplify the co-benefits of our actions. And we'll talk a little bit later about what we mean by co-benefits, but ultimately any action we take on the ground has both biologically relevant and societal benefits. So when we dig into the topic of nature-based solutions, I think there's an important pause that needs to happen just so that we're all on the same page about what we mean by nature-based solutions, because we're hearing a lot about it right now. And really, we fall back to the IPCC definition here of nature-based solutions, that these are the actions that protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems in a way that simultaneously addresses societal challenges, such as climate mitigation and adaptation, and also benefits human well-being and biodiversity. So how do those nature-based solutions work? Really, the goals here are to improve the ecosystem resilience by helping the wildlife and human communities adapt to these changes in the climate, and also protect the ecosystem services via natural infrastructure. They also reduce greenhouse gas emissions from land use and land use change. So we're really looking here to avoid the loss of carbon to the atmosphere. And then finally, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in natural systems, which is a carbon storage approach. So these are really the kind of 3 prongs of how a nature-based solution is effective. The service has a long history of being a leader in delivery of nature-based solutions. I like to joke that we've been doing nature-based solutions before it was cool. A lot of the work that we do on refuges has simultaneous natural benefits. But really the idea is to focus here on nature-based delivery via natural infrastructure and natural climate solutions. And that this terminology that we talk about in today's presentation may be new, but truly these strategies are not new in terms of delivery within the service. These are tried and true interventions. We have this legacy of successful projects. Right here, you'll see in the image the biological carbon sequestration accomplishments report. We have a long legacy of delivering these types of projects on refuges that have these simultaneous gains for human communities. And then really what we're intending to do here is accelerate and expand the delivery of nature-based solutions throughout the service and with our partnerships. And again, can never overestimate the importance of partnerships. I think with the budget situation and also the ability for us to leverage programs beyond the boundaries of any one organization, there's a lot of potential for expanded impact. Natural infrastructure is really any type of living feature that mimics natural ecological processes and provides additional human benefits. And some things that are attractive is that natural infrastructure, or green infrastructure as it's sometimes referred to, is often less costly and actually gets stronger over time with less maintenance or intervention needed than its typical gray infrastructure counterparts. It can also be blended with gray infrastructure. And it has the potential that it can also do double duty by sequestering carbon at the same time. So these are just some examples here on this slide where you see in the lower left that really a denuded riparian corridor can be replanted with native vegetation and trees and really become a riparian buffer strip that serves as that green infrastructure. These planted trees and shrubs along waterways can also deliver important nutrient filtration benefits. And then finally, in the lower right corner here, living shorelines are an ideal example of how we can utilize both nearshore reef systems, woody debris, and onshore for protection of human communities here in the background as well. So these really dissipate that storm energy by slowing wave energy and providing additional refugia on the shoreline. In the forested landscape context, forests and wetlands provide essential services to water utilities, businesses, communities, flow regulation and flood control to water purification and water temperature regulation. So all of these benefits are those that are important to ecological systems, but also to the human community surrounding them. And to ensure that these ecosystem functions and their societal benefits continue, communities really can think about strategically delivering these benefits in the right places through networks of natural working lands, working landscapes, and other open spaces. And these two figures here just illustrate that when you look at high-risk drinking water and watershed systems that the forests are important to in the upper right, you can see that there's obviously a lot of landscape here with really important risks to it. And then in the lower right corner, the sample of cities that have already invested in forest-based natural infrastructure to try to protect those drinking water and watershed categories. So natural climate solutions are similar in that they are actions that provide societal benefits, but they protect, sustainably manage, and restore habitats while at the same time having a substantive carbon storage or avoided greenhouse gas emission component to it. They also provide additional co-benefits such as flood storage and human community resiliency. And really natural and working lands and wetlands and forests play a key role in the global carbon cycle. Natural climate solutions maximize that climate mitigation potential. And what we see here is an example of planting bottomland hardwood tree species at Tensas River National Wildlife Refuge, essentially reforesting in areas that were valuable to the refuge. And really, at its core, this actually addresses part of that executive order that I mentioned earlier on. This gets us towards net zero by 2050, which is a component of the executive order. This graphic in the bottom is from a paper that really indicates that when you look at the land sector, the land management opportunities for restoration and enhancement and conservation, and then really break it down into the types of different natural climate solutions, you can see down here that 24% of that land sector benefit at offsetting the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees Celsius limited reduced warming comes from forest and wetland restoration. So we really, when you look at it, up to 30% of carbon reduction needed to meet that goal can come from the land sector, and 25% of that comes from forest and wetlands. So natural climate solutions become one of the best options when coupled with other clean energy innovation, and decarbonization. And I'd mentioned co-benefits, and this is where I wanted to explain a little bit more what that definition means. The co-benefits in the climate sense are the things that climate mitigation also delivers. Often in the Fish and Wildlife Service, we like to think that the climate benefits are a co-benefit to the biodiversity work that we're doing, but this is the flip way of looking at it, and is how the international community focuses on co-benefits, is to really look at those things that are like the ecosystem service flows from the work that that are also delivered at the same time that the climate mitigation benefit is realized. And when we think about it, it's things that are intuitive, but not often tracked from a performance standpoint with some of the work that we deliver within the Fish and Wildlife Service, things like the recreational benefit, the nutrient cycling, the ability for soil health to improve, economic opportunities for local communities, human health benefits from improved water quality and air quality and temperature benefits, climate resiliency, et cetera. So this is really the opportunity for the type of work that we deliver to really provide win-wins for multiple factors. So what we're doing right now as part of the Climate Change Action Program is that we have a nature-based solutions working group that is really focused on essentially what are the specific types of natural climate solutions that are most relevant to the Fish and Wildlife Service and the delivery of our mission. And of that, we've developed this menu, so to speak, of the types of natural climate solutions that have application on refuges and with our partners, that we really think that all other things being equal, these are probably the highest priorities for the service to focus on at this time. And this really evolves out of building on the success of these types of projects where we have, several dozen of these projects over the last couple decades on refuges and really expanding that focus. So right now we are looking, as I mentioned in the previous slide, 25% of these benefits come from wetland and forested and forests. So really looking at these opportunities in forests is going to be a big part of the focus. To support this work, we're building essentially a natural climate solution toolkit where we're focusing on, in addition to this menu of strategies, developing essentially a roadmap or a cookbook for the menu, I guess, to stay in the same metaphor, of what these strategies are and how to deliver them, with essentially an evergreen toolkit that can be accessed online of spatially explicit maps where opportunities lie to enable folks to prioritize natural climate solution delivery. The idea is also to build some accounting tools that folks can, on the front end, estimate is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak, for a given project. And then also recognizing that this is a portion of our work where we haven't had a lot of policy development. This is one of the areas where the Climate Change Action Program has prioritized carbon reporting policy and crediting policy as a need. The other focus of this team is to really look at cultivating these impact partnerships, to really develop the framework of agreement so that we can all work together to leverage a greater impact than any one partner alone. So really thinking about those pre-mitigation partnerships, how we can incentivize, how can we stack incentives for working lands and partners, and also to think about innovation as we do that. Are there opportunities to look at tree equity as a mechanism for reforestation in urban areas, or bring new partners to the table that are carbon-based investments? So I wanted to give one example. I mentioned we're building a toolkit, and our partners with USGS are a huge lift in that toolkit development. And this is just one example of that. They've been investigating forest restoration opportunities throughout the continental United States. They've really looked at 9 restoration opportunities, and 2 examples of those are provided here on the slide, which I'll talk about in a minute. But really, just want to put the caveat that these are proof of concept. These are very much in the works. So USGS is hoping to have kind of finalized products available soon that we can utilize to prioritize some of these restoration areas. But essentially, one of the examples of that is they've taken a look at burned forest slopes where there are opportunities for reforestation that haven't naturally regenerated to the level that folks we're hoping for. So these are basically an opportunity, a gap in terms of natural revegetation where there could be biological carbon sequestration via reforestation. And that's tree planting on these slopes is estimated that it could sequester 0.4 to 1.5 million metric tons of carbon per year over the long term. So it's a pretty big opportunity. The other example provided by USGS is reforesting urban areas. So what they've done is taken a look at at urban areas to basically look where there are essentially tree and canopy deserts, and urban planting in areas that were historically forested constitutes a pretty large opportunity for carbon sequestration, but also there are concurrent societal benefits everywhere that there are these essential tree deserts. There are higher temperatures and higher health risks as well. So it's really an opportunity to bring societal benefit back into these areas as well. So that's just an example of one of the tools that are relevant to the forest ecology discussion point. So just to sum up, the case for nature-based solutions is really, it really speaks for itself. This really is well aligned with our mission, so much so that we were doing a lot of these types of projects. It's just really looking at it through a different lens and also utilizing the opportunity to leverage so that we can do more of this at scale. And it really is helpful because it addresses site-specific, local, and watershed needs. These are cost-effective solutions to address problems. They have efficacy that improves over time, and the cost of inaction for some of these projects is great. We can experience things like catastrophic wildfire and structural damage. Strategic implementation of nature-based solutions really can maximize those ecosystem co-benefits. So really, when we get strategic, when we really plan on the front end, we can try to maximize the number of co-benefits that were on that wheel that we can achieve with any project. And really, these can be the basis for innovative partnerships that really can expand our landscape scale delivery. So with that, I'll break for questions.
So thanks, Sarah. That was a really nice introduction to the Fish and Wildlife Services Climate Change Action Program, and there definitely are a few questions in the queue. So we're going to take a break for just a second so people can take a break themselves. But hang on here. So here is the Cesar asks. He mentions that there are concerns about nature-based solutions, about how to bring them up to scale. So do you have some suggestions, or are there components of the plan that address how we can bring these up to landscape scale or even to the contiguous US?
Yeah, and so that is one of the reasons we wanted to include these examples of the evolving opportunity maps that are being developed. Many are familiar that USGS has had a land carbon program historically. A lot of the work that was done by that land carbon program served as the foundation for developing these restoration opportunity maps for different types of nature-based solutions. And for the natural climate solutions in particular, on that menu, the focus of our work group right now is to develop those opportunity maps for the continental US at scale for each of those strategies that are in that menu that was included on that slide. So I think that's one way. The other thing too is that there's an intersection between the work of the Climate Change Action Program and the Department of Interior's efforts with America, conserving and restoring America the Beautiful. So really there's an opportunity to take these tools that are being built with the Climate Change Action Program and kind of push the spatial aspects of it into these broader America the Beautiful partnerships and spatial design, so that we really can make sure that as we're starting to stack different things that we're prioritizing, we really get a full picture of where we can achieve some of these simultaneous climate mitigation benefits, along with connecting lands and water to support the America the Beautiful initiative. So I think it's trying to harmonize these efforts and get it into a spatial inventory should help. The other thing that I will say, and I didn't talk about very much in here, is that we really are focused within our work group on trying to develop criteria for projects, for evaluating project benefits, and so that we can have some consistency, but also some shared incentivizing of the types of elements of projects we'd like to see, so that we can get to bigger spatial scales. And then finally, those partnering agreements, developing some frameworks for how we can take basically smaller funding pots from multiple sources and build a larger quilt out of these patchwork pieces is what we're trying to do. And so it's marrying the spatial with the funding leverage of all coming at it together, and then really trying to have a common suite of criteria that we're looking for, so that we can make sure that the types of projects that are being advanced are hitting the mark of getting those ecosystem co-benefits.
So thanks, Sarah. That's helpful. And this is kind of a follow-on question in some ways, and it's a two-part question from Dolly, and she wants to know if there's a public education component to our CCAP program, and and on top of that, is there outreach to private landowners or other potential partners? And Sheila asked similarly, what about land trusts?
So yes, I think, in that early key elements slide, it talks about communication as a piece of one of those key elements, and there's an in-reach and an outreach component to it. So we do have a working group that's primarily communications folks and external affairs folks that are talking about how to take some of the messages and amplify them beyond the service programs. There is also interest in some of these different working groups for CCAP to engage with tribal communities, landowners, working lands. And again, this has a nexus, as I mentioned before with the last question, to our America the Beautiful, conserving and restoring America the Beautiful efforts, which also has a strong working lands and private landowner engagement component as well. So I think, it is just since October that we're standing this up. So a lot of it's still evolving in terms of getting to that point. But yes, that is the intent, is that there is both internal and external communication and outreach, but we're still on the upward swing right now.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And so now it's time for Kurt to take over and tell us about some of the case studies that are out there. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Thanks, Sarah, for advancing that. My name is Kurt Johnson. I am with the Fish and Wildlife Services Science Applications in headquarters. I have been working on climate change issues there for more than 15 years, including development of the Climate Change Action Program and current implementation. And I've been working with Sara and a whole host of colleagues within the service and with the USGS and others on nature-based solutions and biological carbon sequestration. My component of the talk today is to give some case studies of, as Sara said, we've been using nature-based solutions for management of all types of wildlife habitats for years. My case studies will focus on how nature-based solutions, specifically the ideas of natural infrastructure and natural climate solutions, have been used by the service for forest management and forest adaptation with a focus on our National Wildlife Refuge system. We'll give a case study on how we're reconnecting forest blocks, a little bit on adaptive forestry, floodplain protection, one example on urban forestry and tree equity, facilitation of ecological transformation, and then habitat restoration, and finally, avoided carbon loss in peatlands. Next slide, please. Our work on using nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions in particular, with a focus on carbon sequestration, really began in the 1990s, actually, in our legacy, what we call our legacy region 4, the southeastern region. In the lower Mississippi River alluvial valley, habitat had been extensively lost. Bottomland hardwood habitat had been extensively lost due to conversion to agriculture for decades and decades, such that there was less than 25% of original bottomland hardwood forest habitat left. A number of national wildlife refuges have been established in the lower Mississippi Valley, primarily for migratory songbirds, et cetera. And many of those refuges had an extensive refuge boundary that contained both forested habitats and unforested habitats, and also federal lands and non-federal lands. And so Legacy Region 4 started a program to build habitats within these refuges using partnerships with outside organizations, both to acquire land and to reforest that land to create hardwood forest habitat. In Tensas River National Wildlife Refuge in northeastern Louisiana, the service worked extensively with the Trust for Public Land over the course of 6 or 7 years to acquire and reforest almost 11,000 acres of agricultural land that had previously been bottomland hardwood, and convert that back into bottomland hardwood forest. Not only was the Trust for Public Land involved, but there were the Carbon Fund Entergy and other partners involved in the process. This we presented as an example of reconnecting forest blocks, because the main focus was providing a forest connection between forested blocks in the north and south of this refuge. You can see on the map at the right, the light green area and the light blue area are the areas that we reforested and created a block of habitat of 75,000 acres in extent. So quite a substantial block of habitat was created. Co-benefits of the work included protection of the Tensas River itself through riparian restoration and improved water quality within that river, and of course providing increased recreational opportunities from hunting to boating on the river to fishing and wildlife observation. Next slide, please, Sarah. Moving far north, we go from the southern part of the United States to New England, to Umbagog National Wildlife Refuge, which is on the border of New Hampshire and Maine. And refuge managers are working in partnership there with the private forestry sector, actually, to manage forest blocks for wildlife habitat that also consider climate change. They've been working largely in demonstration areas that encompass 3,000 to 4,000 acres of land, where they've used various types of harvest practices, actually selective harvest and also clear cutting, to create habitat for focal species of wildlife, largely migratory bird species. This work has ensured that the work is with the private forestry sector and is intended to promote resilience and climate resilience really in the forest as well, by reducing the risk of wildfire, catastrophic disturbances, and invasive species. Next slide, please, Sarah. Service has many national wildlife refuges that are along river systems. The Patoka River National Wildlife Refuge is in southwestern Indiana. It's a relatively new refuge. It has about a 23,000 acre refuge boundary. And within that, only about 9,000 acres are currently owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service. The service has been building the refuge land base really through partnering with a number of partners, but primarily with Ducks Unlimited and Duke Energy. One example from the refuge that I wanted to give, I think you can see on the map in the upper right, there's 4 blocks that are small blocks that are red in color. And those 4 blocks were purchased by Ducks Unlimited in partnership with Duke Energy. And that was about 187 acres in 4 different tracts. The tracts were then reforested with bottomland hardwood forest, which was one of the main reasons why Patoka River was established in the first place. It's one of the prime examples of bottomland hardwood forest in the Midwest, in the central Midwest. Once the reforestation took place, Duck Unlimited gave Duke Energy a carbon sequestration easement on the lands, and then sold the tracts to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the refuge. Very interesting thing about the reforestation activities at Patoka River was that the refuge worked very closely again with Ducks Unlimited, with Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and with the Forest Service's Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science to develop a restoration plan that actually identified flood-adapted tree species that might gain habitat in the area due to climate change. And they put in their reforestation mix some species that were likely to move into the area because of climate change. So it was one of the first where the reforestation plan was really focused on climate and climate impacts. So not only does the restoration create this new bottomland hardwood forest habitat, but It connects habitat blocks that were there. It helps to make the system more resilient to flooding, and it provides recreational opportunities, all as co-benefits. Hackmetac National Wildlife Refuge is northwest of Chicago. It's about an hour from Chicago, from Milwaukee, and from Madison, Wisconsin, and from Rockford, Illinois, altogether about urban areas of about 12 million residents. Again, this is a new National Wildlife Refuge. It's eventually going to be about 10,000 acres in extent, but at present it's only a couple of thousand acres. The refuge staff has worked with a local NGO called Open Lands, which is dedicated to preservation of open space in northeastern Illinois in this what's called the Chicago Wilderness area. And they're focused there on Hackmetac Refuge and also in the Midwinds Prairie south of around Joliet. But they have an urban forestry program, and so they work very closely with the service to implement some reforestation activities that would consider climate change in one of the watersheds there, one of the principal watersheds, the Neversea Creek watershed. Again, they used the NIAX adaptation workbook to assess what their priorities should be, and they concluded that they needed to remove invasive species and replace them with recommended low vulnerability shade tolerant species to protect the waterways, and then just to protect waterways themselves by maintaining or increasing tree canopy. So at this point, many volunteers are being enlisted to help with these reforestation activities and also with the removal of invasive species. So this project has the co-benefits of increased flood protection on the Neversea Creek watershed, and also drought resistance, and of course, providing habitat connectivity for all sorts of wildlife species. Next. I think many of you have heard of ghost forest. It's an increasing problem on the East Coast, where forests are being inundated and killed due to sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. At Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge over on the eastern shore of Maryland, they have a significant problem with not only sea level rise, but ground subsidence and other factors that are causing marshes to be lost and ghost forests to be created. And so the refuge staff, in trying to address the problem of marsh loss and the ghost forests, have used what's called the Resist, Accept, Direct climate adaptation decision-making framework, and a plan called Blackwater 2100 that looked at climate change and sea level rise to 2100 to decide on some adaptation actions to take. And they decided on a whole suite of adaptation actions, but the one I wanted to focus on was actually a case of, I guess, reverse forest adaptation. This was in an area that's going to be inundated by the sea in the near future, and the refuge has actually gone in to remove trees from this area to facilitate marsh migration into this and to reduce the encroachment of Phragmites, the invasive plant species. So the staff is hoping that this might help guide upslope migration of the marshes in response to sea level rise, and allow the marshes to move in sort of synchrony with sea level rise and how the sea level is changing. So ultimately, the benefit would be continued marsh habitats for wildlife species at Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, and reduced extent of the ghost forests in the area. Next, please. Red River National Wildlife Refuge is another refuge that's more or less in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley. It's a little bit west in western Louisiana. This is another case of restoration of bottomland hardwood forests, but I call this restoring habitat or restoring forest blocks rather than reconnecting habitat. In this case, the service worked with the Conservation Fund to restore bottomland hardwood forests in the area. So the process they followed was similar to what Ducks Unlimited did at Patoka and what the Trust for Public Lands did at Tensaw River. They acquired about 1,200 acres of private agricultural land within the National Wildlife Refuge boundary. They, the trust of the Conservation Fund restored the bottomland hardwood forest by planting native tree species that were specifically selected for the project. And then after the restoration, the land was conveyed to the service for a refuge. And in this case, the carbon benefits from the project were essentially the carbon credits were taken by the Conservation Fund and retired, so they won't enter into any regulatory carbon market at all. This was a project like some of the others in the lower Mississippi alluvial valley that was actually validated for its carbon sequestration potential by the using the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Alliance standards and methodologies at the time. This was done in about 2009, and it got a gold level rating, which is one of the top ratings using this methodology. One of the good things about using this methodology is that it requires monitoring and reporting, and the service had a monitoring report completed in March of 2019 to monitor progress on the restoration efforts and the reforestation and the forest growing. So anyway, next slide, please. Most of the examples I've given to this point have been forest, hardwood forest, and spruce fir forest in the north. Carbon sequestration and nature-based solutions have also been used to restore thorn scrub habitat in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas. This is thorn scrub. It's called the Tamaulipan thorn scrub. It's a unique thorn scrub ecosystem that has incredible biodiversity value, wildlife value for birds, herps, even endangered mammals. And the service has been involved in restoration of this thorn scrub habitat for several decades. It's already worked with partners to restore about 16,000 acres of thorn scrub in the lower Rio Grande Valley. And it's averaged something on the order of 300 acres per year for the last 10 years. The interesting thing about the work is that it's actually taken into account the carbon sequestration value of the thorn scrub habitat. There's been several graduate students in Texas universities that have looked at the carbon storage associated with this thorn scrub habitat, both above ground and below ground. In addition, just this past year, the service has worked with an NGO called American Forests to develop a climate smart resilience strategy for the thorn forest restoration in the lower Rio Grande Valley. Up until now, fairly standard restoration techniques have been used, but this document provides a framework with specific tactics that will consider climate change and how it's going to impact thorn scrub to guide where and how restoration is taking place. So future restoration will be more climate smart than what's come up until now. Next slide. I feel a little bit strange talking about Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge because this is Sara's stomping grounds and this is all Sara's work, and she should rightly be the one talking about this, but I have the honor and privilege of talking in her stead. Pocosin Lakes in eastern North Carolina are peatland, extensive peatlands there. For a considerable period of time now. They've been working in Pocosin lakes to restore these peatlands, essentially to re-wet these forested peatlands to restore the more natural hydrology. By re-wetting the peatlands, this is essentially an avoided carbon loss because it reduces the potential for wildfires in the Pocosin habitats, and also oxidation of peat when it's exposed to the air. And if we get questions, I'm going to let Sara answer them rather than my taking that on. The work has resulted in the development of an American Climate Registry methodology for application throughout the Southeast on the restoration of Pocosin wetlands. They've spent a considerable amount of time documenting the very extensive co-benefits of this peatland restoration. It includes enhanced habitat, water quality, reduction of wildfires and smoke associated with wildfires, saltwater intrusion, etc. So that it has multiple co-benefits associated with it. Next slide, please. So just to summarize the case studies, I know I went through them very quickly because of time, but we just want to emphasize that the service has been involved with the nature-based solutions for forest adaptation for decades, using both natural infrastructure, natural climate solutions. Many of the projects have documented the carbon benefits through standardized methodology, as well as documentation of both qualitatively and quantitatively associated co-benefits of those restoration and management activities. And the one last point I would like to make is that we couldn't have done this without partnerships. Some of the partnerships have been quite extensive between the service and non-governmental organizations and even the private energy sector, which has allowed us to do this work. So partnerships are increasingly and incredibly important to successful implementation of these nature-based solutions for forest adaptation. With that, I wanted to just reiterate what Jeff had said at the very beginning. This is the introductory webinar in the Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife webinar series, which is going to kick off next month and continue for 12 months. The webinar series has 3 parts to it. The first is setting the stage, discussing climate impacts. Part 2 is disturbance ecology and disturbance regimes. And part 3 is forest adaptation examples for wildlife. I think I'll leave it to Jeff to come on and give you the specifics of the date and time for all of the webinars. But I just want to invite all of you to participate. I helped Jeff and our colleagues with the Forest Service, Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, develop this webinar series, and there's a really great list of speakers going to talk about fascinating, interesting, and completely relevant topics for climate adaptation for forest-dependent wildlife. So I encourage you all to sign up and participate as you can. With that, I will turn this back to Jeff and Jim for concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Kurt, and thank you, Sara. That was great. So there are lots of questions in the chat box. So I did want to hit a couple of them. You guys, the way you had your slides set up, Kurt, for each of the case studies, you broke out a lot of the key components. But I noticed there are still questions related to some of the components. For instance, Brenda mentioned, is there a way of accounting for the greenhouse gas cost of implementing the strategies? And then there was also a question about the actual cost, the dollar cost in implementing some of these projects. So I know you can't go through each of these, but are those being captured as well? And are we looking at, when we're, are we developing units for how much carbon we're actually capturing, how much storage there is, and the net benefits of those things, both on the project scale and at a larger scale?
I'd like to actually invite Sara to join back in, because I think she might have more experience with some of these questions than I do. Sara?
Yeah, so I think I got most of that. So yes, I think that one of the challenges, we are starting to, but I think there is an acknowledgement that there needs to be more metrics and performance. So when it comes to these carbon-based projects, there are a couple of different levels of verification. If it's a market-based project using the methodologies like Kurt talked about with the American Carbon Registry, or some of you have maybe heard of the Climate Action Reserve, CAR, these types of methodologies really do have a pretty high bar set for the verification and the tracking of those carbon benefits. And there's these specific methodologies that speak to how you do pre-project baseline establishment, and then how you monitor them over time, and then ultimately validate those as carbon offsets. There's something that I kind of refer to as verification light, which is to do a base target and do performance metrics to try to track some of those carbon benefits. And then also, several of these methodologies have essentially a proxy variable. So instead of doing greenhouse gas emissions on every single project, someone has done significant levels of front-end research to really collapse that into a proxy relationship. So for example, in Eastern North Carolina, we have an established relationship between reduced greenhouse gas emissions and increasing water levels. So we can use that relationship to say something meaningful about the carbon benefits of a restoration action. So I hope that partially answered the question. But yes, there does need to be, in particular for some of these projects that are looking at co-benefits, we acknowledge that we, at least at Fish and Wildlife, have been focused on habitat benefits and ecosystem benefits. And a lot of the ecosystem services, there are economists that track some of that, but we really need improved metrics to say, this project, how much did it benefit that community and in what way, and what is the performance metric for that, so that we're not just tracking carbon, but we're tracking the co-benefits and ecosystem services in a more comprehensive way as well.
And yeah, like Sara said, there's a few folks in academic circles who have taken components of this and looked at it in more detail. I could recall one paper where there was some quantification of the value of carbon at 4 or 5 different national wildlife refuges. There was also considerable amount of work on social and health costs associated with the fires at Pocosin Lakes and also at Great Dismal Swamp. So they looked considerably at mortality and morbidity rates even associated with the smoke of those wildfires, and some of the costs. The social costs, the medical costs associated with it, but those are more specific cases, and some of them are focused on very specific topics like these fires. So, did I capture that right, Sara?
I do know that the metrics are tricky in these, and I think we're still trying to all get that right. And you guys, I give you a lot of credit for trying to really, hit on some of those metrics. And I do see that Roman mentioned in here that the Perini Foundation is using a blockchain-based carbon pool to scale up to a bankable form. Do you guys have any comments on kind of, blockchain and kind of carbon banking or some sort of carbon-based monetary device that's in a blockchain format? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I can try to tackle it. So I'm not familiar with blockchain. I will say that, for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we've said this for a long time, that our focus is pretty directly linked to the habitat uplift, and the carbon is potentially monetizing the carbon is not something that we focus our energy on so much as delivery of the habitat benefit, the carbon associated with it, to the extent that it's a valuable mechanism for partners to quantify that and monetize that. That's beyond our focus to some extent. So I think, that's a poor answer to your initial question, but really our focus is the carbon as it relates to habitat and finding out the amount of that, but actually monetizing it is less the priority as opposed to quantifying the magnitude of the uplift for the greenhouse gas avoided emissions or storage.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think that's getting there. It's a complex topic. I keep trying to think how I would explain that, but I'm not up to it. So yeah. So hey, we're coming up right on 2 o'clock. So I don't want to keep people long, but I will point out that before we drop off here, Maria Genoviak, who is one of the partners with NIAX, who helped us develop this series, did list the web link that will take you to will allow you to register for the rest of the series and to see all the additional presentations and dates. Basically, we will have a webinar on the 3rd Tuesday of every month for the next 12 months at 1 o'clock. There are a couple like just before Christmas when it's the 2nd Tuesday, but generally we're the 3rd Tuesday. And we hope you'll join us. We hope you look at that at the website, and that is on the NIAX website where you guys can see that. And so thanks to everyone for joining today, and a big thanks to Sara and Kurt. And I will say we didn't get to all the questions, and oftentimes what we try to do, if there are a lot of questions left over, we try to answer those and send it back out to the group later as a full group. And if you guys are interested in looking into questions you might have asked that weren't answered, maybe we'll have some answers there for you. So with that, I just wanted to thank NCTC, thank NIAX, thank all our partners within Fish and Wildlife Service for helping us put together this webinar series, and particularly for all you that joined us today. Thanks so much, and I hope you will join us on April 19th for our next webinar. Thank you so much, and thanks again, Kurt and Sara. Way to go.